Okay, everybody's here. Thank you all for coming. I hope you all had a great weekend. And today, the meeting is about something we have been looking forward to the whole session. We have Professor Cindy Wen coming to visit our classroom and give us a lecture and to have a Q&A session to answer your questions that you have about both the article that you've all read and maybe some general questions about how to study or the histories of former French Indochina. Let me start with introducing Professor Wen to everybody. It is my great privilege to introduce Professor Wen to everybody. Professor Wen is currently a postdoc fellow at Brown University. She earned her PhD in history from UC Berkeley in 2019. And she is also a newly appointed assistant professor at University of Ottawa. And before that, she will hold another very prestigious position, that is a chancellor's postdoc fellow at UC San Diego. UC San Diego. So Professor Wen's research focuses on the history of Vietnam, Southeast Asia print culture, digital humanities, and libraries. Her book manuscript, Misreading the Social Life of Libraries and Colonial Control in Vietnam, 1865 to 1958, examines the cultural and political history of libraries in Hanoi and Saigon from the French colonial period through to the decolonization of libraries. And I also want to mention, okay, this is the academic part of Professor Wen. And in addition to being a great scholar, she is also an artist, a poet, a technologist, a filmmaker, a publisher, and a feminist and a refugee. I mentioned this, I emphasize on this because actually a lot of students here, they are also artists, photographers, filmmakers. They are all very talented, and they often ask me the question, how do we become academically successful without giving up the other side of our passion? So I think Professor Wen will be a great role model for everybody, to do everything well and be what I think I don't know how to continue, because that's just my dream, that was my dream. I wanted to be everything, but I failed. So I'm getting a little bit sensitive when I'm talking about this, but you will see. Let's get the conversation begin. So I think before Professor Wen starts her lecture, which will be followed by your questions, maybe you can quickly introduce yourselves too. Let's make it quick so that we can have more time to for the real discussion. Maybe later when you ask a question, if you want to, you can say a few more words about yourself before your question. But for now, let's just talk, say maybe your name and where you're from, something like that. I will say, let's go with in order on my screen. So maybe Hao, you can go first.
Okay. So hi, nice to meet you. I'm Hao. I'm a junior at Duke Kunshan. I'm from Chongqing, a city in the southwestern China. Yeah.
Okay, great. Ariana.
Hi. Nice to meet you. My name is Ziyu, and my English name is Ariana, and I'm from Nanjing, the capital city of Jiangsu province. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, Snowy.
Hello everyone, my name is Kaixin Guo and my English name is Snowy. I'm a junior student in DKU and I'm from Yangzhou, a city of Jiangsu province.
Sophia.
Hello, my name is Sophia. I'm a freshman at DKU and I'm from Orange County in California in the United States of America.
You will hear something great later in a minute.
Also from Orange County, actually.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah, you can meet up at some point back home. Mark?
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Zhuan Ma, and my English name is Mark. I'm a freshman at DQ, and I came from Wuxi, Jiangsu, which is close to Kunshan.
Kunshan is the city where the university is located. Weiran?
Hi, my name is Weiran, and I am a sophomore at DKU who is majoring in literature, and I am from Shandong, Jinan.
Tony?
Tony, I'm currently a first year MA student of East Asian Studies at Duke, and come from Shanghai, 40 miles away from Kunshan. Yeah.
Great. George? Very cute background. George?
Thank you. I'm George. I'm from Suzhou, next to Kunshan also, and I'm a sophomore at Kunshan University, and I'm studying art history.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, so much for. Yeah, I said. Yeah, it's. I said something like. Anyway, it's great to hear about your hometown again. Okay, then I will zip up my mouse, and the time is all yours, Professor Wen.
Thank you so much again for having me and for that very generous introduction, Sean. It's such a great pleasure to be able to virtually meet all of you. And thank you also for just sharing your hometowns. I have not had the opportunity to go to China yet, so it's something that I've wanted to do in my life. So I get a little bit of a geographic orientation through meeting you. So to just briefly introduce myself, my name is Professor Cindy Nguyen. It's very kind that I was introduced as someone who does everything, because I think I am somebody who, maybe part of this is that one, I get easily bored. So then I'm always like jumping around different aspects. And I think that's why, I'll explain this later, but that's why my primary research project on history of libraries is very fitting for me, because it's big enough that it could really explore many different avenues, from like social spaces to print culture to history of colonialism, but it's also contained because it's an institution, it's a space, it has an order, an organization. So it contains my intellectual curiosity so that people understand what I do, which I think is really important as you're just figuring out things that you want to either research, or either professional paths or ways of making a hybrid of different either professional, academic, artistic interests, is trying to find a topic of which that could be easily communicated to other people so that they understand, but also like continues to inspire and interest you over time, especially if you're someone like me who easily gets bored. So I just wanted to, before I forget, I don't know if you've seen this already, but this is just my website. Like, feel free. The website is just cindyawen.com. And then what it kind of points to a little bit of more about my background and different ways in which I've kind of stitched together both my teaching, my research, my digital humanities work, as well as my artistry work. So, you know, like I have like resources on teaching during COVID. This is when I led like a translation workshop that was more of like an arts translation workshop about like how to do creative translation. And then this was like when COVID first hit, and I made like a short film about like the sense of time. So I made this film here, and thinking about like history and agency. So there's a lot of different topics here, but like on the topic of colonial Indochina, which is of today's, this draws from a course that I taught. Now I've taught twice, one in person and one remotely. And then if you click on that link, then you can see other resources related to teaching this course, where there's like a virtual reality module. So you can even experience that if you're interested in just exploring different virtual spaces, particularly this project called Virtual Anchor. I'll just click on it because it's really fascinating and I've been part of it. So the website is virtualanchor.com, but you get to explore 13th to 14th century Angkor Wat and an Angkor metropolis through these virtual reality experiences and 360 videos. And it's just like really fascinating if you think about both the creative and visual ways in which we can understand the past through archaeological sites, but also trying to think about these historic sites as lived, right? So like having, like, for example, this is an image like of a marketplace. They're not just, you know, these really dynamic spaces that aren't just relics of the past. So I've been involved in this project now for 2 years and thinking about how to teach. I think I'm on here somewhere. Oops. I think, yeah, this is my class, for example, when we were experiencing it through virtual reality. And then going back to the website, yeah, so if you're interested, you know, continuing on researching colonial Indochina, I also have my syllabus here. If you click here, you just have all these additional readings, if that's something that you're interested in, like themes on the French Empire, things about the different regions, on Cambodia, on Laos, on economics, on culture, because I understand that your class, and also I believe some of you are in the colonial or imperial class, colonialism class, and some of you aren't. So it'll be very new. So if you wanted to dive deeper, these are just more resources. So I want to jump straight into it because I was tasked with just presenting pretty much anything, but oops, it's not loading. Come on, what's going on? It's black screen for you, right? Let me just skip this. Let me just start this again. So I was tasked with this, and I think it's really hard because I was like, do I just reduce and abridge a whole semester's worth of class into, I don't know what's going on with my slide. Oh, here we go. Into a few minutes, so know that I'll go fast. A lot of this is I was excited to share with you about colonial Indochina, and also because I know some of you watched the film Indochina or Indochina that was made in, I think, the 90s, about a colonial plantation and the relationship between like a French mother who owned the plantation as well as an adopted Vietnamese daughter, and then like kind of their love affair, as well as like kind of the background is like the communist movement and political uprisings against the French, as well as class uprisings and class tensions between kind of the essentially indentured slaves and workers that worked on the plantation, and those who benefited economically from colonialism through either partnering up or owning these slave plantations. So I know some of you watched this movie, some of you didn't, don't worry about it. I just wanted to give kind of a background primer on kind of some of the themes about Indochina, as well as to orient you geographically and think about legacies. And then we'll transition into the article that you read that I wrote about libraries, and then we can open up to questions. You can ask about, so I said the structure and the presentation is like this, but like you can ask really about anything from the background about Indochina to thinking about the legacies, as well as colonial libraries, or even other things that you come up with. So I'll jump into it. So Indochina, thinking about what, where, and when is really useful because this geographic entity doesn't geographically exist anymore as an ex-colony. So where actually? So to situate ourselves, when I think of Indochina, the framing of Indochina is in Southeast Asia, first of all, and in mainland Southeast Asia. Today, Southeast Asia consists of these 11 countries, and they're often divided by the island nations of Philippines, Brunei, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Timor-Leste or East Timor. And then the mainland, which is today Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. So Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam was historically French colonial Indochina. And another way of this is another map of looking at Southeast Asia and how it was divided up by Western colonies, as well as, I think here they didn't include the US as a colonizing force too in the Philippines in this map, but French Indochina here consists of those 3 countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and here you have Siam, and then these are the color-coded based on the different Western imperial countries within Southeast Asia. So the challenge of studying this region of Indochina is that it was considered a French colony and federation from 1887 to 1954, but a theme that you might have experienced either through the class or just in understanding how colonial institutions and colonial states are created is that they're never even. They happen very unevenly, both geographically, politically. So this is a French map that actually shows the conquest of Indochina and how it spans over time. So French conquest of Vietnam began in 1858 in this terrain and Saigon region. So this is the color according to time. So starting here in Saigon and Cambodia, and then going to Cambodia, and then expanding into this region in Northwest Cambodia, and then from there jumping to the Tonkin Northern region. I'm sorry, and then here in this region, stitching together the rest of Eastern Indochina, or what we now see as Vietnam, Central Vietnam, and then finally conquering Laos. What's interesting about this map too is that it's important to think about conquest conquest was happening with French military battles, but really contending against a pre-existing kingdom and structure, which is the Nguyen dynasty, which had authority over this region here, which is now Vietnam, as well as different kingdoms in Cambodia and in Laos. Another map or way of thinking about conquest, which is interesting, is a topographical map, which is a map that shows the elevation of land. So if you look at the areas that are green, that's lowlands, and generally lowlands is where water, wet rice, agriculture, cultivation occurs, and often where cities develop. So more architectural like kingdoms, as well as like institutions are developed in these greener lowland areas, and they're generally richer. That's where like farmland is cultivated. People like civilizations develop because there's food and different habitation. There's transportation through these waterways. So another way of looking at the conquest map is also looking at a topographical map where the French came in was in the lowland areas, setting up bases in South Vietnam, this really rich Mekong Delta region, and into the Cambodia lowland region, and then up to the Red River Delta region up here. One of the motivations or the primary motivations for the French to be in colonial Indochina was that by 1870, there was a new government that emerged in France called the French Third Republic. And their rise to power was combined with an attempt to gain international legitimacy as well as domestic legitimacy. France was trying to compete with other European powers, as I mentioned, like British, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and then later the Dutch, who were in Southeast Asia, and they wanted to compete and ultimately find a trade route to China and India, and wanted access to, especially for China, access to porcelain silk trade. But when the French came and set up base in Indochina, they also tried to make it economically viable. And these were very exploitative situations in which the French transformed the landscape, set up mining industries. Here, for example, I think this is like silver and metals mining into the countryside and into the mountains, where they employed a lot of corvée or indentured servant type laborers. So indigenous Vietnamese populations, some ethnic minority populations, to work and mine the countryside. The plantation economy, which I hinted at before, also relied upon a lot of local laborers and really extracting primarily resources such as rubber and coconut, for example. The other aspect of the structure of French colonial state and the Indochina was that, I mentioned it's a lot of text, but essentially when the French came into Indochina, they set up a very elaborate administrative state that tried to synthesize and create these 5 regions that I mentioned. So Tonkin, which is North Vietnam, Annam, Central Vietnam, Cochin China, Southern Vietnam, Cambodia or Cambodge, and Laos into administrative territories that the French could rule. And this was based on kind of looking at Indochina creating Indochina as a synthesized like administrative apparatus, but also as separate territories with different ways of ruling. Many of those who were on the top administratively were French. And then later, as you go down into the lower ranks, particularly into the general services, and local budgets, you actually have Vietnamese collaborators who are working with the French to administratively rule the colony. So there were some Vietnamese who were then sent to like Laos and Cambodia to rule. But then also in Cambodia and Laos, the French maintained the previous pre-colonial kingdom, or the king, at least in name. So a lot of Laos and Cambodia was ruled indirectly, whereas especially in Cochin China was ruled directly, where basically the Nguyen dynasty, the previous Vietnamese emperor, was really just a figurehead, and most of the law and legal apparatus, taxation, things like that were completely created from scratch, from newness, and then brought over from France and implemented into the country. So rather than going into the details of what that looked like, that meant that there was essentially a really heavy bureaucratic apparatus, a lot of laws, a lot of kind of punitive judicial type extractive measures like taxes on people that basically were created and overlapped over a very diverse region. So I mentioned like a diversity of language, ethnicity, and region. So here you have all these different language groups, and just in the central or in the southern Mekong Delta region, where you have people who are speaking combination of Chinese, of Khmer, of kind of a more like ethnic minority Highland languages, such as Mao, like the Karen people, the Thai groups, as well as those who are ethnic Kinh, who are ethnic Viet, the majority of the ethnic population in Vietnam, who are generally were in the lowland areas. So here is just another map of different language groups that you see. So here a lot of the Viet or the ethnic Kinh are in the lowland areas, hence a very different kind of, I would say, socioeconomic difference between the Vietnamese who were in the lowland areas and who ended up being in cities or ended up being educated, collaborated with the French, who worked within the colonial apparatus, for example. And the Chinese population too are primarily in the cities and trading areas. So thinking about like just like, okay, so all of this, like what's the takeaway or the legacies from this? One of the main takeaways is that the nation building and creation of these national boundaries of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia were really cemented during the colonial period, because the French colony was like built upon these existing kingdoms, but it actually exacerbated the tension, which is like, for example, using Vietnamese or the ethnic majority Vietnamese population to rule the highland areas in Vietnam, but also to rule and be collaborators in Laos and Cambodia. And this has contemporary repercussions of the ethnic tensions between Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The other side is that there's all these creation of national boundaries, but then it has an impact because a lot of these areas actually are very have ambiguous borders, especially in the river areas, which isn't really a natural border because people are moving between the borders quite fluidly. Other aspects is there's tremendous changes during the colonial period, but it's important to think about like how, so I said like transportation, migration, urbanization. I'll just showcase a few images. So you have like the development of roads, for example. Here's like a family where you have like the French couple here, and then like a Vietnamese family who kind of lived within this French family's apparatus, like kind of family structure, but then also kind of were like the servants of this family. But you have paved roads and like development of movement between and within like Vietnam, for example. So you have like a main railroad, this blue one that runs down Vietnam and then into Cambodia a little bit, as well as there was a very big important railroad that developed for trade reasons to Yunnan, to Lao Cai and Haiphong. So this is the one that goes from Hanoi, from the coast into southern China for trade reasons. But you see also like they also run along lowland areas, right? Because here you have like a huge mountain pass that was really difficult to actually develop. And then you see no railroad development in Laos because a lot of Laos is a bunch of mountains. So you see again kind of the ways in which colonial transformations are very uneven geographically across Indochina. I think some of the themes that you had maybe talked about in your class was about exoticism and cultural essentialism. This is a tourist map that was created by the Tourist Bureau in Saigon that was designated and focused for European, primarily French tourists who wanted to come to Cambodia, to Vietnam, to Laos, Indochina. And here kind of showcases like all the ways in which kind of a certain essentialist or cultural commodification of these territories, like showing like the temples or different types of musical instruments, or kind of the developing kind of this exotic or romantic aspect of what it would look like for a French person to come to Southeast Asia, to Indochina. And then another big transformation though was the development of cities. So you have like trams, more mobile types of ways like bicycles. These are types of rickshaws where there's vast majority of migrants who are coming from the countryside developing these cities because that was where the economic opportunities were. A lot of people came in working both as merchants, but also other types of servant type industries, different types of small trades and production. And the cities were really what was very transformative during this time, especially the 1920s to 40s. That being said, cities were very uneven. This is from a great book, if you ever get a chance to read it. It's called The Great Hanoi Rat Hunt. And it's actually a graphic book that's based on history. And it shows how, like, for example, on this left here, this is Hanoi. There was a division of like the native quarters, so the indigenous Vietnamese population. And you can see here where like the streets are much more kind of organic. But then there's segregation that was created in Hanoi, where this would be like, this is only where the indigenous or Vietnamese population could live, habitate, work, whereas the French Quarter, a much more kind of structured, linear, quad-like, grid-like. And this is kind of where a lot of the new buildings were developing, kind of like in the next roads and new administrative apparatus. So that kind of pictured here. But you can see like there's actually a lot of destruction that was happening. So here, for example, as like this shows like the French who were trying to create this urban landscape would destroy like temples and build upon and exacerbate kind of this tension between the white French and the indigenous population. But that being said, like by the 20s and 30s, like it wasn't just a white versus Asian tension. There was a tremendous class tension too, is like within the cities. There were a larger class of Vietnamese intellectuals, of those who became rich either through, they were rich before, either because they had plantations even before the French were there. They excelled in the administrative or education structure that was created during the colonial period, or they were merchants. So there was like a larger class of Vietnamese kind of middle class who, you know, were participating in new cultural practices, such as like, for example, here you have tennis. They were defining, this is an image of a very popular women's newspaper that was developed. Here, you know, you have like Nestle advertisements. So a lot of these cultural capital and capitalistic commodities that were coming in from around the world, flooding into the cities and transforming the cities. So I mentioned cities, development of the bureaucratic state. Besides that, there was also a language revolution too, because we're getting educated through the schools. And then in Vietnam, which is the country that I do most of my work on, Vietnam was the Vietnamese, the language became like the official language, as well as Vietnamese as well as French became the official language. So then people were using, more and more people were becoming literate within Vietnamese and French, and really creating this revolution of newspapers and communication. The other aspect that happened too is that with the concentration of people, new ideas, cities, and new kind of intellectual groups, there was also tremendous disenfranchisement of others as well, because there's opportunity, but there's also disenfranchisement. I think the plantations are a really key example of how individuals get taken advantage of and into the kind of a debt bondage slavery situation, of which people get indebted to these plantation economies where families cannot like repay the debt to the landlord, and then they get stuck basically for generations working for these landlords. another way is like some of these migrants that were coming from the countryside into the cities were also experiencing a lot of different types of debt industries, like working in as like rickshaw drivers or as like in tea shops that were catered towards kind of the richer elite or to Europeans. And they were stuck in these cycles of debt. So, you know, these are some of the like the negative aspects of colonialism, where it's creating these regional divisions, a lot of inequality. In terms of gender too, there were women who then kind of disenfranchised women too, who didn't have like social support, who migrated into the cities and then would get caught up in different types of industries, from kind of working as sex workers, but also as servants in a lot of these families. There was a lot of racism and legal pluralism, which is that, you know, for example, if a French person drove an automobile and hit a pedestrian, like they wouldn't get in trouble for it. But if it was like flipped the other way, that like a French person or a Vietnamese person was driving or actually had an accident with a French person, they would basically get imprisoned. There was a lot of unequal ways in which the legal system was implemented. And embodied in this is that there was a huge prison system that was for petty crime, that was used to imprison individuals that were like participating in petty crimes, such as like stealing or not paying your debt. And then we would put in these like really harsh, horrible prison systems, as well as for those who were dissidents. So those who were rejecting and kind of rising up against political injustice were also imprisoned in very violent ways, in this as pictured here. And important to understand is, as those that were resisting and like with the rise of these print urban communities, especially of Vietnamese who are coming together, exposed to new ideas, connecting to new print industries, writing in newspapers, reading French newspapers and global newspapers, as well as Chinese newspapers. There was a circulation of new ideas about independence, about calling out inequality, about the unfair limited opportunities for the indigenous population within the colonial structure. And by the 20s to 40s, you see, for example, here in Vietnam, you see the rise of newspaper production. So like these are indigenous newspapers that are created, and you can see every year more and more newspapers where people are debating, discussing both political as well as social ideas. And a lot of the ideas that were developed on these ideas during this time by these political activists were led by urban youth educated individuals that were educated in a Franco-Vietnamese or Franco-Indigenous schools. And this is where they were exposed to like ideas such as communism, anarchism, Marxism, as well as other forms of collaboration. And here are like three key individuals that really were spearheading the different ways in which Vietnamese groups were responding to colonialism and envisioning a future. It wasn't always clearly anti-colonial. There was sometimes like this discussion about like, could there be kind of Vietnamese-French collaboration, such as like Bùi Văn Chiêu, who created these political parties within the French colonial state, whereas Nguyen Anh Ninh was very influenced by these like utopic anarchist ideas, where he was very skeptical of all political organizing. And then Ho Chi Minh, who famously kind of was leading and influenced by communism and Stalinism, and shaped a lot of like notched onto communism as a political tactic of anti-colonial movement. And this is a lot of text, but I know because it was in the context of the film that you watched. But I wanted to show how there were different types of political mobilization that happened in the 20s that wasn't always clearly linked to like a clear communist movement. So like, of course, like there was a lot of influence actually from China. So different political parties that were developing in China at the time, from like the nationalists, the Kuomintang, as well as the Chinese Communist Party in southern China. And then in Cochin China, which is South Vietnam, were very much influenced by like other forms of ideas that were like influenced by like religious organizing, popular culture, very influenced by French Trotskyists and French socialism as well. So there was like a lot of flows in terms of the political ideas that could shape how to overthrow and either how to overthrow the French or how to envision a future that was collaborationist. That being said, a lot of these are more like intellectual organizations that didn't have like mass appeal. They didn't have mass appeal until the Indochinese Communist Party, which was actually founded in Hong Kong. So it was founded abroad and then later was shifted by the 40s into kind of a broader based nationalist movement rather than purely communist. And then it was first framed as an Indo-Chinese Communist Party. So then this is a communist party that would integrate both Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. But then by 45, this separated out because the different political missions of Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos was different. So it separated out into a Workers' Party of Vietnam, Communist Party of Kampuchea, which is Cambodia, and a Laos People's Party. So that was a lot in terms of like kind of just going through the political aspects. And I know that you read the article, so I just want to transition into like, okay, so I studied colonial Indochina, all these different types of political, cultural, social transformations that happened during the colonial period. But for me, I'm a cultural social historian. So I'm more interested in the ways in which these either political, infrastructural changes impacts culture, impacts the ways that people envision their world, people create cultural products such as like books and films and art, as well as imagine ways of identity and social identity. So that's how I came upon the history of the library. And I was interested, as I said before, is that the library is this institution, but there was certain cultivation of types of behavior through this institution because the library that was developed in the Indochina period was very different than the pre-colonial library, which is more Confucian scholarly developed, whereas the French library that influenced Indochina library was more built upon these notions of control. So creating these spaces that were all about like silence and what we think of maybe as a Western library that's like quiet and respectful, modern, having a public aspect too. And then, as someone who exists in the 2021, I'm also interested in how people interact with information and knowledge. So then I was thinking really like historically, this is how individuals were accessing ideas. They were accessing ideas either through like newspapers, but also through the library. So I saw the library kind of like as an internet, like a proto-internet where people are selecting books of interest and exploring ideas and having like a certain individual self-empowerment through the ability to self-select what they wanted to read. And as I said before, like I get to like discuss and think about a lot of different topics through studying the lens of the library. And just as a refresher for those who don't really remember the article, or also I wanted to show a few images from the article, the reading rules article that I circulated that weren't published in the article. So this is just like an image of the storage depot of the books that were in Hanoi Central Library. So that library was then the biggest library in all of Indochina. At some point it had over 100,000 books. And this is like this is a Vietnamese librarian orderly who would retrieve the books that were requested from those in the main reading room. So that, like, for example, this is the individuals in the reading room and they would like submit a request and then someone would go in the depot to pull the books for them, or people would end up coming here to study. You see here, actually, a lot of the people in the reading room were young men and young Vietnamese men, which is something I talked about in the article. Just to look at the architecture too, the one that you read was about the Central Library in Hanoi, which is built in this kind of, why am I blanking out on the term? I'm just blanking on the term, but built in this very kind of Western style with like high facades, large entranceways. Here too there's this like Romanesque, Greco-Roman kind of style that was built in Cambodia. And here is the Kunshan Library in Saigon. A photo of a library card by a Vietnamese individual, an intellectual and administrative person that would request books from the library. This is an application to make a library card. It wasn't all men, so I did find some women who were using, Vietnamese women who were using the library. And it was important, like as they submitted applications, that they have to like basically go into this contract that they recognize they have to be responsible for the books, and then they have to pay if like any of the books are damaged. And I go in to argue how this creates this culture of reporting and consequences, and thinking about creating this culture of a modern public space and the responsibilities to those spaces. And I talk a lot about how the reading room got taken over, really, or according to the French, taken over by Vietnamese young boys who were basically taking over and using the space not really for reading, but for socializing, which I find really apt, just because it's a nice public space. You see here with the good lights, good lighting, ceiling fans, so people would come in here during the summers when it was really hot, as well as in the winters when it was too cold. So people would really use this space in a very social way. And here's just a graph of how over time the number of Vietnamese really increasing rapidly compared to the French that was slowly decreasing. I think that's just more about kind of how popular the reading room in Hanoi was, with over 50,000 consultations compared to even French libraries, which was more like 60,000 or 30,000. And then there was, besides the reading room, there was a lending section where people would come in, they can borrow books home. It would require, you would leave a little like a little deposit before checking out the book. But then that allowed people to kind of like freely peruse the shelves and pick up novels, for example. Here's just a breakdown of the Vietnamese readers, like how over time more and more student readers, primarily high school student readers, took over the primary population of those who are in the library. And a sense of like what people are reading is that people are reading a lot of literature, collected volumes of French literature, popular novels such as crime, adventure, women's literature, like The Tale of Monte Cristo, even later on, like translations of Pearl S. Buck's The Good Earth, a lot of like global bestsellers and materials in French, as well as materials from like English that were translated into French. And I think this is an image of the Saigon Library, which wasn't the topic of the article, but just showcases how popular it was. And I wanted to show too that it wasn't just Vietnamese who were using the library, but here's like a French woman who was also using the space. I think there's another French woman back here. I think by way of conclusion, like what I'm interested in for the book, and for the journal article, which is part of my larger book called Misreading, is I'm really interested in this relationship between the colonial state, how the state created these libraries and envisioned the libraries to be these like symbols of modernity, as well as like ways to control information, to control basically and prevent people from political organizing that was happening by like Vietnamese who are reading kind of revolutionary material through newspapers in the streets, and they wanted to create like this alternative space of information control, but also how these big libraries shaped literacy and language in Vietnamese and also in French. And then the relationship on the other side is like how the public shape and use the libraries in their own way as public space to supplement their education, because like education wasn't even, and many didn't really have access to schools. So then they wanted to like, so how people developed and their own kind of education curriculum by picking the books they wanted to read through these libraries, and how that shaped kind of their understanding of the world. So I think that's it. And I wanted to transition into any questions that you might have, as well as comments, or if you had anything you wanted to elaborate on, or just responses to what I talked about.
Thank you so much, Professor Wen. Thank you so much. I did feel bad because I asked you to cover a large ground in a given time, but you have just proven to us it's not possible to give a great introduction to the history of Indochina in, let's say, half an hour. It's also more than that. It's possible to do that in a very fantastic way. So let's see. Because my feeling doesn't matter. What matters is what the students think about And what are the questions you want to ask? Just go ahead. Feel free to just start speaking.
I wonder, like, what are the local people's attitude towards those French institutions nowadays? Like, at first they were built for the to connect the French intellectuals with the European intellectuals, but gradually it becomes a social and it become a space for the Vietnamese young boys, as you said. So I wonder what are the local people's attitude towards those places?
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of disaggregate what we mean by local people too. I mean, first of all, that's a really good question. And I think you're right in pointing like how there's like the vision of what these institutions are supposed to be and then the reality. So as I was showing you like these images, like you saw like a lot of Vietnamese boys who are using, Vietnamese men, young men who are using this space. You know, they're dressed very well in like a suit. Generally, these young men are urban. They live in the cities already, or just recently migrated to the cities. They are they're literate. So they're literate in French usually, and also in Vietnamese. So that means that they had some type of like class upbringing that class opportunity that connected them to get more access to either schools or books and things like that, of which were quite expensive. So like there's that group of individuals who just saw these libraries as this tremendous resource, because even though these individuals are like kind of at the more like middle class, they're not like the super rich, because the super rich would still like have their own private libraries and wouldn't really need to use these spaces. But these were like kind of the newly kind of aspiring individuals who just either migrate to the cities or kind of were the first in their family to go to like through some type of education system. So they saw this as an opportunity, because this is a resource that was essentially free if you were going to check out books in the main library, like the Hanoi Central Library, and read it in place, as an expansion and an access to a lot of material, like thousands and thousands of books, but also of newspapers, because a lot of newspapers were available freely in the library too. That being said, like there was also like I didn't really specify this in the article, but in my other research, other people who saw that Hanoi library as still very French. Even though there were a lot of Vietnamese who were using the library, they saw it as like this symbol of like Frenchness and very like inaccessible. And some of the cases, like there was overt racism where, like if, for example, if you were a Vietnamese person, you had a library card, you know, everything all set, like you enter the library, you'd always like the clerk who worked in the front desk would be like, you know, checking your library card, making sure you have a library card. Whereas like a French person could just like walk in without really using any of the protocol that was really in place. And there were other cases too where like a French library patron who would visit the library, like had like kind of looked at a lot of the library staff who were actually Vietnamese, like lower level library staff were Vietnamese, as kind of like their servants. And so there was like kind of the tensions in the library too. So then because of those tensions, like in kind of, I read a lot of other newspapers that were published in Hanoi that would talk about the importance of the library system. And they basically were saying, like intellectuals were saying, the Central Library is great, but it's really not accessible and it's only in Hanoi. Like, what about the rest of the country? Or even like, and what about those who, you know, so French was a common language that was taught in the schools, but the majority of the population spoke Vietnamese. And then when Vietnamese became standardized as with the Roman characters, then it was easier to learn Vietnamese too. So more and more people by the 20s and 30s were using Vietnamese, like publishing in Vietnamese, writing Vietnamese too. But most of the collections in the Hanoi Central Library were still French. So then a lot of people were like, wait, like we need to develop like another library or add more collections to the Central Library that had Vietnamese language materials too. So there was a lot of kind of, to make it pretty simple, like kind of tensions about thinking that even though people were using a lot of Vietnamese were using the library in Hanoi, it was still seen as not necessarily a library of the whole for everybody. It was a really great resource for like a select few, not select few, but like for those who had literacy in French, those who had some education, those who were in the city, which is also a large population too.
Oh, thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
I also saw some questions.
Yeah, we received some from, so so I want to say, Mark, I saw your question was the first. I would encourage you to read the question by yourself, but I don't. But I don't. If you don't feel comfortable, you don't have to. I can read on behalf of you, or maybe it's fine to read it by yourself. Maybe, Mark.
Okay, dear professor, I have a problem that you mentioned that the Central Library had a very fundamental influence on the modernization of Vietnamese. So why didn't it open a lot of branch libraries and form a library system at that time in Vietnam?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So in some ways, it opened up a few branch libraries. So do you remember in the lecture I was discussing that the development of colonial Indochina was very uneven, like a lot of influence or development first in the Saigon area, and then later into Cambodia, and then into North Vietnam, and then Central Vietnam, and then Laos. And that's kind of like how it developed. So there were, because of like kind of these different territories of Indochina throughout Vietnam, or Indochina, there was essentially different branch libraries that had developed kind of to serve that specific area. So the Cochin China Library that I showed in the picture in Saigon, that was developed in the 60s or 1860s. And then later on, the Central Library in Hanoi, that was developed in 1919. And that was after like Indochina as this region was then like formalized by like the turn of the 20th century. So then what happened was like the Hanoi Central Library kind of like became the capital headquarters of the library, and the Cochin China Library had to kind of follow suit, but it really existed before and kind of operated somewhat independently. And then there were other libraries, as I mentioned, like that developed after the Central Library. So you have the Cambodia Library in Cambodia, and then later a library in Hue. So these are kind of branch libraries, but they're more like little like small national libraries. They're more like equivalent national libraries because even though it wasn't like a nation yet, of course, because this is under the colonial period, but they're like these region national branches that operate as collecting all the materials that were to serve that specific territory. And then the other interesting part in my research is that by the 30s, there were other initiatives to bring libraries outside of the city. So I don't think I prepared it here, but there were these different like book trucks that would come from, especially from Saigon, and ship out like 1,000 of the books from the Saigon Library and drive them into the countryside. And then the truck would basically like make stops in the different provinces in the countryside, and then people could check out books for 2 weeks. And then while the truck keeps circulating around, when it comes back, then that's when people would return the books. And that was one way to like bring the books into the countryside. But I wouldn't say it's lots of, because I think there are lots of branch libraries and formal library system. It was still relatively limited. A lot of this had to do with like infrastructural things, with like roads. Like it was difficult to bring these books into the countryside just because like you had to like follow some of these country roads were like not as developed. And again, it was also a question of literacy into the countryside too, is that who is literate? So a lot of these people who were checking out books from these book trucks or book wagons worked in the administration. So it could be like Vietnamese individuals or French individuals who worked like as low-level like secretaries or teachers in the countryside. And then they would check out books, and they would actually read socially too. Like it wasn't just one person reading a book just for themselves, like they could be reading them for other people. So that part is a little bit harder to track, which is like how people are, because I could have the information, the data from my archives about like who's checking it out, but it's a little bit harder to see how people are reading and using the books. But I have some other evidence that points to like that it wasn't just like people were only those who are literate were reading, but people who are literate were also reading like for other people, like reading out loud, reading in groups. And the other question about a larger, so actually like one of my arguments is that like it's important to think about how, because it's one of these tensions is like, all right, so the library served a group of people but it didn't serve everybody, but like how does that kind of connect with this idea of like modernity or modernization for the Vietnamese? And my argument isn't so much that because like another way of framing this is that like how truly public was the library? And my argument is that being public doesn't just mean everyone having access, because that's more of like thinking about the mass, right? The mass or the common people. Instead, public has two dimensions. Like one dimension is like you do want like a larger population, like thinking about like increasing access. But the second aspect is the idea of public has to connect a lot with the idea of the state too, which is a public institution needs to also embody kind of certain public visions, which is like this good. So this like book or this library is a symbolic good for the nation, for all the people. So essentially it has a very deeply symbolic role and also deeply state-centered role of like how can this public good serve the state in different ways. So that's where my argument was saying that there was like a lot of cultivation of what was in the library as being kind of apolitical or not like anti-colonial. And so that's why when thinking about the library system, it's an apt metaphor to think of it as also like a parallel education system where people are having access to different types of reading materials, increasing their literacy, developing language, acquisition through Vietnamese and French, but also like engaging with new types of materials that are recently published as well as historic materials.
We suddenly received a big number of questions. You guys
yes, I saw. So now I need
yeah.
to shorten my answers.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Wow. I just want to encourage. Does any of you like want to speak your question in person? Maybe to give Professor Wen a break. Oh yeah, Tony, if you'd love to speak your question in person.
No, I think Aaron and Snowy, they raised their hand before me, so I think they can go first.
Okay, fair enough. I didn't see that. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I see Professor Will mentioned the increasing number of Vietnamese people using the reading rooms, but some scholars criticize on the useless leisure reading of those people. And I think it's kind of unrealistic for common people to start reading scholarly reading to like develop their reading habits. So I'm curious about how you see this trend.
Yeah, I think the moral or cultural judgment of what is considered like proper behavior in a library versus improper behavior is something I'm really interested in. Because like I mentioned before, some people were using the library not just for the materials, but for the space, as like this quiet retreat, or really as like a way to meet friends and lovers and things like that. And it was like a social space in that sense. And the trend of like the criticism about kind of leisure behaviors is underneath it is what I was discussing a little bit earlier, which is this French vision that's really kind of is really based on a racist vision of what is considered modern. And being modern has this notion of being Western, like following on like only proper behavior that is like respectful reading in the materials, or like kind of respectful use of these, almost like treating the library as a sacred space, like sacred official space, that's like funded by the government and like is used like almost like should be this intellectual oasis of like higher scholarly thinking. But then really like younger people were kind of coming in and then using it for education and for learning, and many of the higher level who are French administration saw that as like an undermining of what was the original intention. The other aspect is that the rise of the decline of like French and then the rise of the Vietnamese showcases also how the French government felt uneasy about just racial tension in these spaces. Is that they were building up these different, the government built up all these different types of like institutions, but it wasn't clear whom they should serve. Like initially it was very much for Western, for the French, but then like as more Vietnamese were really working on the administration, were being collaborators, and there was a lot of kind of discourse or tension between like, oh, the French are modernizing and providing all these like benevolent opportunities for the Vietnamese, but that is in itself built upon a racist hierarchy of saying that like, oh, the French know better than the Vietnamese and know this is how one should use the space. This is what is envisioned. This is what is considered proper. And it's very like belittling, right? Like, so like the French create this hierarchy and see the indigenous population as almost like children that need to be guided in a certain way. So that's another way of framing kind of the hierarchy that I see in the library.
Thank you, Dr. Wen. I'm so happy to see our students have so many great, they are so enthusiastic to have so many questions. And I'm also very grateful that Dr. Wen is taking every question so seriously. But I should let everybody know that Dr. Wen has something else scheduled after this. So we should not keep her here too long. So I want to ask if it's fine with Dr. Wen, maybe we take 2 more questions. And for those of you who wrote your question there but couldn't get a chance to ask a question in person, I think my personal feeling is that Professor Wen has covered some of them since. So 2 more questions, is that fine with you, Professor Wen?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, then who was going to speak?
So I have a question here. So like in your paper, like you mentioned that for those librarian users and especially those Vietnamese users, kind of reading in the library is a kind of privilege for them. And also like they have this reading course, and in some occasions your reading course got canceled, and they write letters to the librarians to kind of ask them back. And most of those readers, their males, their like teachers, students, and so I'm wondering that so what could the rise of reading bring them, and like would this privilege make them like distinct from other Vietnamese, and how should we see these people and their impact? Yeah.
That's a really great question. I think it extends a little bit from the question from Hal earlier, and thinking about who are the local people who are using the library. But specifically like the instance of those who are writing and like asking for their reading card. The 2 instances that were cited, one was that many saw this as an opportunity as their primary way of education. So this was an education at this time was an opportunity still for economic mobility, because there weren't that there were really, really limited opportunities to basically change your social class during the colonial period. One was education, or moving to the city and then becoming educated, and then finally landing some type of regular job within the bureaucracy. So you could be a secretary, or you could be a librarian. You could work at one of the government offices, and this would afford you many, both financially, but open up other types of connections that could kind of raise you and your family's position in society during this time. So that's like one way where the library like offered this opportunity for people to kind of complete and supplement their educational materials, but also some of the people like teachers, but also there were low-level administrators who needed for their work to use the library too. So that's when they lost their card, it was like they could not really do their work anymore. But thinking about more broadly about how to see the people and their impact, I think, I mean, this connects, I'll briefly, like this connects to this really great question that Tony mentioned about the public sphere, which is that those who were participating, who were able to read, was really, really diverse. Like it was diverse in that like those who, it wasn't always like, because I think often the discussion regarding a public sphere is that it becomes politicized, where it's those who participate in the public sphere are those who basically kind of see themselves as this like imagined community of political actors who either are talking back or resisting the state. But that's just one community of those who are reading. The other community are just kind of other low middle class people who also want to develop their education and saw reading as this community linguistic opportunity to develop their language and then change their social economic class. And that's kind of the group of people that I was examining specifically who are using the libraries. And then it's these individuals who then like form the bureaucracy, because I think one misconception is that it's like, when you think about colonialism, it's like those who are just like pro-colonialism, and generally like they're the white outsiders, and then there's like a class of like collaborators who are like very like politically pro-French. But I want to make that, and then there's like everybody else who is like anti-colonial and hate the French and are really frustrated. But it's really more of a spectrum, and it's like more interwoven, is that there's like a large population of people who are just trying to survive. And if it meant like working in the government, then it didn't mean they were necessarily pro-French. Actually, a lot of like the famous communist leaders all worked in the government. Like they all got educated, and that's how like they went to these libraries, they exposed themselves to these new ideas, and then they happened to later go and become communists. But then there was also other like people who basically ran the bureaucracy, who were secretaries, who were administrators, who that was how these institutions basically afforded them different types of opportunities for their families.
So Tony, I know you were raising your hand, but since Dr. Wen has already addressed your question very considerately when she was answering Ariana's question, so I wonder, is that fine with you to give the last chance to someone else?
Yeah, sure. If there's another future opportunity, I'd love to discuss more about the public sphere. It's a big topic, so right now I can just skip me.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Yeah. I would encourage you to continue investigating. There's a lot of interesting comparison with modern China too. I think it's, I think it's a really interesting topic. And what is it? Semi-colonialism and like Shumacher, like, and then like writing about colonial identities. I think it's really interesting.
Okay, then we have the last chance. Who would love to ask a question in person? Sophia, go ahead.
Okay, so you said earlier on in the lecture that the city of Hanoi was segregated. So I wanted to know, was the library in the like native Vietnamese part of the city or the French part of the city? I assume it would be in the French part of the city. And if it is, like, how did this segregation like limit access for the Vietnamese locals and people who were maybe too poor to travel to different parts of the city?
Yeah, thank you for finding that connection. Yes, it was. It was on the boundary between. It was kind of on the boundary of all three, like the administrative part, the Vietnamese, and then the French, but really more in the French territory. And you can see that just because of like the development in the building, it's like very like grand and these like big boulevards. So in terms of the space, the native part or the indigenous part of the city was one where a lot of the indigenous population was living, as well as where they were producing a lot of their commerce, like not farming, like markets and selling kind of smaller goods like textiles and tools and things like that. And a lot of the population lived there. That being said, even though they lived there, a lot of the Vietnamese population also worked in the French administrative neighborhoods too. So there was like, it's like living segregation and somewhat working segregation, as in terms at least of like the types of work. So if you worked in the administration, the French bureaucracy, then you would go into, it wasn't like a wall that separated individuals, but it was more of a habitation segregation. And you can see it in the architectural layout of the city, where like Vietnamese would see like certain neighborhoods as like, this is the French area, whereas the other one's like, this is like where we belong, like this is like, or where we were designated as belonging, as the Vietnamese neighborhoods. And then because Hanoi was actually designated as the capital of Indochina, there was just a lot of administrative offices and bureaucratic buildings in the city. And that being said, next to the library, there were also other types of buildings too that weren't just administrative buildings, but like there were a lot of schools that were building up in Hanoi, as well as like the first university that was built in Hanoi, and people like Vietnamese who enrolled in the university or the different high schools were able to attend and would like go and be in those parts of the cities too. So when I say like segregation, it was definitely much more in terms of architectural layout and habitation, but there's like some fluid movement. I think in terms of like a certain aesthetic, like those who are in the French quarters, like those Vietnamese, like you can tell like they would be dressed much nicer, like wearing like a three-piece like Western suit. And I mentioned like a rise of a certain urban middle class or educated class too. And these like they would be like sitting at cafes and then kind of there would be like French individuals too. It's important to think about in terms of population density size. Those who are white French, like there were not that many. It was French Indochina was not a settler colony, so there weren't mass movements of immigration of like white French settlers who were coming to Indochina to live. So many of them, like there were only like a few thousand really, and they would occupy like the highest rungs of the administrative apparatus. But I think what's interesting is that a lot of the racism and the segregation occurs performatively, which is that like there was a lot of buildings that were created that were like kind of designated as these like the modern, not indigenous buildings. These were very, very French. And they are like really cultural symbols of what the French called as a civilizing mission, which is like, oh, to justify why the French were in Vietnam, is that like, oh, this showcases France's grandeur or whatever. But there was like a tension because like Vietnamese individuals would see these spaces. Some would like really kind of start to believe it in a sense, like they saw these like, oh, these are the grand spaces and these are different than like the Vietnamese spaces. And then others also were like resentful of these spaces, and many of those who saw the resentment end up being like more fiercely anti-colonial, would write about it and would talk about like inequality and lack of access, and then kind of showcase like the class inequality too, which is like thinking about all the servants who have to work in these spaces who are often Vietnamese, who are like poorly paid and kind of abused as well. So I just wanted to, I hope that like through this discussion, I was able to kind of like add nuance to the different layers within colonial society, that it's not just always like white versus French or anti-colonial versus pro-colonial, but like I think the library is a very apt space because it shows how like there were these overlapping spheres of both like political, social class, kind of overlap of like of how people were forming ideas and experiencing the urban environment like through this French institution.
Okay, I really hate to be that bad person to end such a lovely conversation. But as I said, we should probably let Dr. Wen go. But the good thing is that actually I didn't mention this to Professor Wen. I already sent the link to your website to everybody before the meetings. I believe some of them have been enjoying the rich contents there. And by saying this, I think that means our students know where to find you. So I hope you won't be bothered in the future if some of them reach out for further discussion or are trying to get more advice about this topic, or just as I said, how to become good at everything at the same time. So let's thank Professor Wen again for this generous visit and for the lecture and for everything she has done for us. Thank you. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. And yes, definitely do reach out. I just want to say I might be a little delayed in responding. I have a 3-month-old baby, and I'm in the middle of like moving between different institutions and all of that, and COVID, I think it's like a very stressful time, but I really, really appreciate having this opportunity to engage with all of you, and really sharp, amazing questions. Thank you for taking the time to read my article, and for your engaging questions and finding connections between like the lecture, but also like other cases, like thinking about modern China. And I think that there was also another question about Japan, but I hope that you do reach out. I have a lot to learn too, like about, actually, I really am hoping in my next revision to look at more comparisons transnationally across Asia too, looking at China, Japan, other spaces of this like hybridity, cultural hybridity, and how colonialism plays out in these different regions. And yes, best of luck with the rest of the term, and for those and just stay safe and healthy. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you. Duke Kunshan University is particularly strong, or at least they are doing very well in developing curriculum in terms of how to understand China in a global perspective. Some of the students are some of them are majored in global China studies, some of them are in global cultural studies. So I think this will be a great place. What I'm saying is that I will hope to maybe have you again here next time in person, since you are talking about the transnational perspective on cultural studies. Okay, so everybody else have a good night, and Dr. Wen, have a good day.
Thank you so much. Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.